Under the Napa Valley moonlight, Clarence Clare Robinson was locking his wine cellar door, the old wood creaking as he turned the key. Out of nowhere, Karen, the new neighbor, stormed up, hollering, "What are you doing in there? That's not yours!" She dialed 911, swearing he was a thief breaking into someone's stash. A patrol car rolled in minutes later, lights cutting through the dark. But when the deputy stepped out, he grinned at Claire, and the night took a turn. "Stick around for this one. It's a good tale. Tell me your town if you'd like. I'd love to hear where it reaches." It was one of those crisp Napa Valley evenings, the kind where the air carried the faint sweetness of grapes and the old oak trees stood like quiet sentinels over the red brick houses. Clarence Clare Robinson, 67, stepped out from his back porch, his boots scuffing the gravel path to the wine cellar sunken behind his home. In a faded work jacket and jeans stiff from years of use, he moved slow but sure, a man who'd earned every line on his face. The cellar door, weathered oak from the 50s, creaked as he checked the hinges, same as he'd done every night for decades. Claire hadn't come from money. His granddaddy was a grape picker back in the Depression, hands rough as the vines he tended, teaching Claire the art of winemaking in a shed out back. From those dusty lessons, Claire built something, a little cellar he dug himself in '83, a few barrels at first, then a name, Robinson Vintage. 40 years on, his wine-filled glasses in Napa restaurants even won a blue ribbon at the county fair once. This cellar wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was where he'd raised 3 kids, sent them off to college, and kept a piece of his granddaddy's dream alive, now that his own hair was gray. He took pride in it, same way he'd tended the vines or stirred the barrels, steady, patient, right. That night the valley was still, just the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. Claire ran a hand over the door, feeling the grain, then pulled the big iron key from his pocket. It was a ritual locking up what he'd built, a nod to the years behind him. Then came the sound. Sharp footsteps on the gravel cutting through the quiet. Claire turned, squinting into the dark, and saw her, Karen, the new lady from across the way, marching toward him with a look that said trouble. He figured she'd say hello or ask about the vines like folks usually did. He didn't know yet that this night wouldn't end with just a locked door. Clare Robinson stood by his wine cellar door, the iron key still warm in his hand, when Karen Mitchell's footsteps crunched closer across the gravel. The Napa Valley night was cool, the moon casting long shadows from the oaks, but her voice cut through it sharp as a knife. She stopped a few feet off, hands on hips, her sweater catching the light like she'd just stepped out of a catalog. "Hey!" she barked, loud enough to stir a dog barking down the street. "What are you doing down there? Who let you near that cellar?" Claire turned slow, setting the key on the ledge by the door. He'd seen folks like her before, newcomers who thought they owned the valley the minute they unpacked. "Evening," he said, voice steady as the oak behind him. "I'm Clarence Robinson. This is my cellar. Just locking up for the night." Karen let out a laugh, short and brittle like glass cracking. "Your cellar?" she said, crossing her arms tight. "I've been here 3 weeks, and I know who belongs around here. This isn't yours. I'd have seen you before. You don't look like you own anything worth a dime." She flicked her eyes over his faded jacket, the dirt on his boots, the lines carved deep in his hands from years of work. He tilted his head, taking her in. Claire had heard this tune plenty, back when he hauled barrels for pennies, when folks smirked at a black man with a dream of wine. "Been here 40 years, he said, calm as ever. "Dug this cellar myself in '83. Maybe you ain't been around long enough to know me." She snorted, stepping closer, her shoes grinding the gravel. "Dug it? Oh, come on now. People who own cellars like this don't lock their own doors. They've got help for that. You look more like some drifter sneaking around, sniffing out a bottle to steal." Her words landed hard, meant to sting, but Claire didn't budge. He'd taken worse from foremen who thought he'd never amount to much, from customers who'd rather buy from someone else, until they tasted his vintage. "If you're so sure," he said, resting a hand on the cellar door. "Tell me who owns it then. What's their name?" Karen's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Her face went pink, a flush creeping up her neck, and she fumbled for a beat before jabbing a finger at him. "Don't play smart with me," she snapped. "I don't need their name. I can see what's what, and you're not it." She fished her phone from her purse, stabbing at the screen with a manicured nail. "I'm calling the cops. We'll sort this out quick." Claire raised an eyebrow, but his feet stayed planted. "Go right ahead," he said, folding his arms. "I'll be here." Inside, though, he felt that old ache. Not anger, just the weariness of proving himself again. 40 years of sweat in this valley, barrels he'd rolled, bottles he'd labeled, kids he'd raised off this land. And here was this woman, 3 weeks in, acting like she could wipe it all away with a phone call. 911, yes, hello, Karen said, her voice climbing high and shrill. "There's a strange man breaking into a wine cellar right across from my house. He says it's his, but I know he's lying. He's probably stealing. Hurry." She shot Claire a look, smug as a cat with a mouse. "They're coming! Let's see you talk your way out of this one." "Fine by me," Claire said, leaning against the door frame. He'd faced down bigger storms. Grape rot in '92, a fire that nearly took the house in '05. A loud neighbor wasn't about to shake him. But he couldn't help wondering how she saw him, a thief, a nobody, when every bottle in that cellar carried his name. Karen paced a few steps, phone pressed to her ear, muttering loud enough for him to catch. "This place was supposed to be peaceful," she said. "I didn't move here for riffraff sneaking around at night. Should have known it'd gone downhill." She glanced back, her eyes narrow. "You'll be sorry when they haul you off." "Riffraff?" Claire repeated, keeping his tone even. "Folks who lock their own doors?" "Don't twist my words," she fired back. "You know what I mean. Look at you, worn-out clothes, dirty hands. People who own cellars don't look like that. They don't grub around in the dark." He almost smiled, just a flicker, but held it in. "Been grubbing around since I was a kid," he said. "Learned it from my granddaddy. Built this place from nothing. Guess that makes it mine." Karen rolled her eyes, turning her back. "Sure you did. Keep talking. I'll let the police figure you out." She tapped her foot, staring down the street, waiting for the lights she was sure would prove her right. By now, the commotion had stirred the neighborhood. Old Mr. Hensley, who'd lived next door since the '70s, cracked his window, peering out with a frown. Down the block, Mrs. Delgado, whose wedding Claire had toasted with a free bottle in '98, stepped onto her porch, arms crossed. A couple of younger folks, weekenders from the city, poked their heads out, drawn by Karen's voice ricocheting off the houses. The valley wasn't quiet anymore. It was waking up. Claire stayed where he was, one hand on the door, the other in his pocket. He could have gone inside, grabbed the deed, the awards, the faded photo of him and his granddaddy by the first barrel. But he didn't move. Long ago, he'd learned some folks wouldn't see the truth unless it came from someone else, someone they couldn't argue down. So he waited, the night air brushing his face, the key still sitting on the ledge like a quiet promise. "You'll see," Karen said, half to herself, her voice sharp with triumph. "I've got an eye for trouble, always have. Back in the city I'd spot a crook a block away. This is no different." "Trouble?" Claire said, soft but clear. "Ma'am, I've locked this door every night for 40 years. Only trouble's the racket you're kicking up." She spun on him, lips tight, ready to snap back, but headlights flared at the end of the street. The patrol car was coming, its red and blue glow bouncing off the vines in the dark. Karen straightened, a smirk tugging her mouth. "Here they are," she said. "Time to face it." Claire didn't shift. He'd seen worse than this. Banks doubting his loans, storms threatening his crop, whispers trailing him in a valley that hadn't always welcomed him. A woman with a phone didn't rattle him. He glanced at the cellar door, solid as the day he'd set it, and figured he'd pour a glass once this was done. For now, he'd let the truth roll in with those lights. The car slowed, tires crunching to a stop, and Karen waved it down like she'd won already. Claire stood steady, the man who'd built this life, waiting for the moment she'd see she'd picked the wrong fight. Claire watched her pace, the moonlight glinting off her phone as she muttered into it. He could have said more, told her about the blue ribbon from '95, the way his Cabernet saved a failing restaurant down in St. Helena. But he didn't. Words wouldn't shift her kind. He'd learned that the hard way. Instead, he let the night settle around him, the crickets picking up where her voice left off. The cellar door stood solid behind him, a testament to years she couldn't see and wouldn't care to. Karen hung up, shoving the phone back in her purse with a snap. "They'll be here any minute," she said, turning to him with a gleam in her eye. "I've dealt with people like you before, thinking you can just waltz in and take what's not yours. Not on my watch." She planted herself a few steps away, arms crossed again, like a guard at the gate. "People like me?" Claire said, his voice low but carrying. "Folks who've worked this valley since before you were born?" She scoffed, tossing her head. "Don't give me that. I've seen enough to know who fits and who doesn't. You're not fooling anyone with that story. Built it myself. Please." "You think I'm stupid?" Her tone dripped with disdain, each word a jab she thought would knock him down. Claire shifted his weight, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Never said you were," he replied. "Just saying what's true. This cellar's mine. Dug it, stocked it, locked it. Been doing it longer than you've been breathing Napa air." Karen's smirk faltered just for a second, but she doubled down. "Oh, you're good," she said, wagging a finger. "Real smooth talker. But talk won't help you when the cops show up. They'll see right through you, old clothes, sneaking around at night. You're done." He nodded, slow and deliberate, letting her words roll off him like rain on a tin roof. "Guess we'll see," he said. Inside, he pictured his granddaddy, bent over a barrel, showing him how to taste the grapes, how to wait for the right moment. Patience had built this life. Patience would see him through this too. The neighborhood was stirring more now. Mr. Hensley, his white hair poking out the window, called over, "Everything all right, Claire?" His voice was shaky but kind, the voice of a man who'd bought Robinson Vintage for every anniversary since '78. Mrs. Delgado leaned on her porch rail, frowning at Karen. "What's all this noise about?" she muttered, loud enough to carry. A few porch lights flicked on, dots of yellow breaking the dark, and Claire could feel the eyes on them, waiting to see what came next. Karen noticed, too. She straightened up, raising her voice like she was on a stage. "This man's breaking into that cellar," she declared, pointing at Claire. "I caught him red-handed, acting like he owns it. I'm just doing what's right, keeping this place safe." Mr. Hensley squinted, adjusting his glasses. "That's Claire Robinson," he said, slow and puzzled. "Been locking that cellar since my knees still worked." Karen whipped around, glaring. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man. He's a liar. I saw him sneaking." Mrs. Delgado stepped forward, her slippers slapping the porch boards. "Sneaking? Claire gave me a bottle for my 50th wedding. Best wine I ever tasted. You're the one making a fool here." Karen's face tightened, her flush deepening, but she waved them off. "You're all too trusting," she snapped. "I know trouble when I see it. This is my neighborhood now, and I won't let it slide." She turned back to Claire, triumphant. "They'll back me up when the cops get here, you'll see." Claire stayed quiet, his hand brushing the cellar door. He thought about the bottles inside, rows of them, labeled by hand, each one a piece of his story. He'd survived lean years, bad harvests, folks who'd turned up their noses at a black vintner in a valley full of big names. This wasn't the first time someone had sized him up and seen less than he was. It wouldn't be the last. The sound of tires on pavement grew louder, the patrol car turning onto the street. Karen's smirk widened, her eyes locked on Claire like she'd already won. "Told you," she said, stepping aside to let the light sweep over him. "Time's up?" Claire didn't flinch. He'd locked this door through storms, through summers so hot the vines wilted, through nights when he wondered if the next batch would sell. He'd earned every inch of this ground, and no phone call was going to take it away. The car stopped, doors creaking open, and Karen waved them over, her voice rising again. "Over here, officers!" "He's the one." Claire stood tall, the key glinting on the ledge, the cellar behind him like a rooted oak. He'd built this with his hands, his time, his name. Whatever came next, he was ready, because the truth didn't need shouting, it just needed to be seen. The patrol car's light swept over Claire Robinson's wine cellar, painting the old oak door red and blue as it rolled to a stop on the Napa Valley gravel. Karen Mitchell stood triumphant, her arms crossed, her sweater glowing under the glare like she'd just won a prize. The neighborhood hummed with voices now, porch lights on, folks stepping out into the cool night air. Claire stayed by the door, his faded jacket catching the breeze, the iron key glinting on the ledge like a quiet witness. He watched the car doors swing open, steady as ever. Deputy Mike Hargrove stepped out first, a stocky man in his 50s, his uniform creased from a long shift, gray flecking his temples. Behind him came a younger officer, barely 30, his badge catching the light. Karen pounced before their boots hit the ground. "Here," she shouted, pointing at Claire. "This man's breaking into that cellar, claims he owns it. I know he's lying, he's a thief, probably worse. Check him out, quick." Clarence took a step forward, hands loose at his sides. "Evening, Mike," he said, nodding to the deputy. "I'm Clarence Robinson, this is my cellar. Been mine 40 years, just locking up." He gestured to the key. "Got papers inside if you need 'em, but I reckon you know me already." Mike squinted, then a grin broke across his face, slow and warm. "Claire Robinson?" he said, stepping closer. "Hell, I'd know that voice anywhere. You're the fellow who made the Cabernet for my wedding. Best damn wine I ever tasted. This is your place, all right." He turned to the younger officer. "Tommy, you ever try Robinson Vintage? My wife still talks about it." Tommy nodded, a smile tugging his mouth. "My pops buys a bottle every Christmas. Says nobody in Napa does it better." "That's you?" Karen's jaw dropped, her arms falling slack. "What? No," she sputtered, her voice climbing. "That's impossible. He can't own this. Look at him. Old jacket, sneaking around. He's lying. They're fake, those papers." She jabbed a finger at Claire, her face red as the wine he bottled. Mike held up a hand, cutting her off. "Hold on, ma'am," he said, his tone firm but patient. "I've known Claire 20 years. Bought from him, shook his hand. This cellar's his. Been his since I was still in uniform, chasing speeders." He glanced at Claire, tipping his head. "You got that key, huh? Fits the lock." Claire picked it up, slid it into the lock, and turned it with a click. The door creaked open an inch, the scent of oak barrels drifting out. "Fits like it always has," he said, stepping back. "Built this place in '83. Me and my granddaddy's lessons." Karen shook her head, wild now. No, this is wrong. You're all mixed up. He's tricking you. Those could be stolen keys. Check his story." The crowd was growing, Mr. Hensley hobbling over with his cane, Mrs. Delgado right behind, a dozen others spilling from their houses. Hensley tapped the ground, his voice sharp. "Claire's been here longer than any of us. Gave me a bottle for my 40th anniversary. Best in the valley." Mrs. Delgado nodded, hands on hips. "He toasted my 50th with a red so good my husband still brags about it. This lady's got no clue she's the trouble here." Voices rose from the group. Neighbors, young and old, some holding glasses from their own stashes of Robinson Vintage. Claire taught me to make wine in my garage, one called. He gave us a case for the church raffle, another shouted. Phones came out, filming, the murmurs turning to cheers. Karen shrank back, clutching her purse. "You're all crazy," she yelled. "He doesn't belong here. I know what I saw." Then a new voice cut through, a deep, steady one. Mayor Ed Rollins, a gray-haired man in his 60s, pushed through the crowd, his coat thrown over pajamas. "What's all this racket?" he asked, then spotted Claire. "Claire Robinson, what's going on?" Mike tipped his hat. "This lady called us. Claire's breaking in. I told her she's got it wrong. This is his cellar." Ed's eyes lit up. "Breaking in? This man's wine's been on my table 30 years. Saved my first campaign dinner when the caterer flopped." He turned to the crowd. "Folks, this cellar's a Napa treasure. Claire built it from nothing. I say we name it right now. Robinson's Cellar." The cheers erupted, loud and warm, hands clapping, glasses raised. Someone ran to their porch, grabbed a marker and a board, scrawling "Robinson's Cellar" in big letters. They propped it by the door, and the crowd roared again. Claire stood there, a small smile breaking through, the weight of it sinking in, not heavy, but good. Mike turned to Karen, his grin gone. "Ma'am, you filed a false report. Slandered a good man, too. Claire could press charges, and I'd back him." Karen stammered, her triumph crumbling. This can't be. You're all in on it." Claire shook his head, calm as the valley night. "No charges, Mike," he said. "Reckon she's learned something tonight? That's enough." He looked at the crowd. "If y'all ain't busy, I got a barrel inside. Could pour around." The cheers doubled, folks pressing closer, laughing. "Pour it, Claire," they yelled. Karen turned, head down, slipping away as the crowd parted. Tommy smirked, muttering, "That video's hitting the valley by morning. Wine whiner ain't gonna like it." Mike clapped Claire's shoulder. "You're a better man than most, Robinson. Let's get that glass. I owe you one." Claire nodded, the cellar door opened behind him, the truth standing tall as the oaks. The night wasn't quiet anymore, it was alive with voices, and he was right where he belonged. The patrol car's lights dimmed as Deputy Mike Hargrove tipped his hat one last time, the Napa Valley night settling back into its quiet hum. Claire Robinson stood by his cellar door, the crowd of neighbors buzzing around him, their voices a warm mix of laughter and chatter. The air smelled of oak and wine now, not just grapes. As Claire swung the door wide and stepped inside, Karen Mitchell was gone, slipped off into the dark, her sweater a faint blur crossing the street, her front door slamming shut with a thud that echoed. Mike lingered by the car, shaking his head. "You sure about no charges, Claire?" he asked, leaning on the hood. "She called us out here for nothing, slandered you good, too. That's not small potatoes." Claire shrugged, pulling a dusty bottle from a rack inside the cellar. "She's got her lesson, Mike," he said, voice steady. "Don't need a courtroom to make it stick." He cracked a grin, holding up the bottle. "Tell you what, if you and Tommy got a minute, I'll pour around. Been a night, hasn't it?" Mike chuckled, a deep rumble. "Can't say no to that. Robinson vintage beats paperwork any day." Tommy nodded, grinning, and the two officers followed Claire up to the porch, their boots crunching gravel. The neighbors didn't need asking twice. Mr. Hensley hobbled over, cane tapping, his wife trailing with a tray of glasses she'd grabbed from their kitchen. Mrs. Delgado hauled a folding chair from her yard, plopping down with a laugh. "Claire, you owe me a toast after all this racket," she said, winking. More folks drifted in. Some old-timers who'd known Claire's granddaddy, others newer but loyal to his wine. Soon, a dozen or more were gathered, glasses clinking as Claire poured from the bottle, a deep red catching the porch light. "Made this one in '95, Claire said, passing a glass to Mike. "Took the ribbon that year. Granddaddy'd have been proud." The deputy took a sip, eyes widening. "Lord, that's smooth." You're a magician, Robinson. Laughter rippled through the group, warm and easy. Hensley raised his glass. To Claire! Best damn vintner in Napa and a better man than that fool woman deserves. The toast echoed, glasses chiming, and Claire nodded a quiet thanks in his eyes. He poured for Mrs. Delgado next, her smile wide. Tastes like my 50th all over again, she said. Your keeper, Claire. Across the street, Karen's blinds stayed shut, but the neighborhood wasn't quiet about her. That video's gonna be all over by breakfast, Tommy muttered, sipping his wine. Folks at the station'll get a kick out of whiner. She's done herself in. Mrs. Delgado chuckled. Saw her hightailing it. Bet she won't show her face at the market tomorrow. Word spread fast from there. By morning, the clip shot from someone's phone hit the Napa grapevine, then spilled online. Cellar owner shuts down Karen, read one post. The shaky footage showing Mike's grin, Claire's key turning, and Karen's red-faced retreat. Folks started dropping by, old customers like Ed Rollins who'd slapped Claire's back and ordered a case, and newcomers curious about the wine man who'd stood his ground. Heard you gave her what for, one said, buying a bottle. Best story I've heard all year. Kids on bikes slowed by the house, whispering. That's the wine guy, Claire's son called from Sacramento, laughing over the line. Pop, you're a legend now. Mom be proud. Claire just smiled, shaking his head. He didn't care much for legends. He cared about the cellar, the vines, the life he'd built. But the voices around him, the hands reaching for his wine, felt good. Karen's house stayed dark that week. Down at the farmer's market, someone spotted her grabbing eggs and bolting, head down, no eye contact. She'll think twice before dialing next time, Mr. Hensley said over his fence, and Claire figured he was right. The valley had spoken, loud and clear, and it wasn't on her side. Claire stood on his porch the next evening, a glass of his own vintage in hand, looking out at the cellar. The makeshift Robinson Cellar sign leaned against the door, a little crooked but solid. The air was cool, the vines rustling, and the night felt right again, like it belonged to him, same as it always had. The Napa Valley mornings turned crisp that next week, a faint mist curling over the vines as the sun climbed slow. Claire Robinson didn't rush to finish locking up anymore. The cellar stood proud with its new sign, Robinson Cellar, nailed up by Mr. Hensley and a few others during a Sunday afternoon laugh. It was rough-edged, the paint a little uneven, but Claire liked it that way. Y'all went and made a fuss, he'd said, shaking his head, but the smile stayed on his face as he poured them around from a '98 vintage to say thanks. Word of that night kept rolling through the valley like a good harvest. Folks who'd known Claire forever stopped by with grins, slapping his back, buying bottles to toast him again. Newcomers showed up too, weekenders from San Francisco, retirees from down the coast, drawn by the story of the wine man who'd shut Karen down. Heard you're the real deal, one said, handing over cash for a Pinot. Best tale I've heard in years. Your wine's just a bonus. Business picked up, steadier than it'd been in a decade, and Claire found himself dusting off old barrels to keep up, his hands moving like they had 40 years ago. Kids on bikes pedaled by, waving. Hey, Mr. Robinson, they'd call, and he'd wave back from the porch, a glass of his own red in hand. His daughter called from Oakland, her voice bright over the line. Pop, they're talking about you all over. Saw that sign online. Granddaddy'd be laughing his head off. Claire chuckled, sipping his wine. He'd say I stirred up too much noise, he told her, but the warmth in his chest said different. The cellar wasn't just his anymore. It was the valley's too, a piece of their story now. Across the street, Karen Mitchell's house stayed still. Her car came and went, quick and quiet, but the blinds never lifted. Down at the farmer's market, folks started calling her wine whiner to her face. Soft enough she couldn't argue, loud enough she'd hear. She'd grab her bread and scurry off, no chit-chat, no eye contact. The local paper ran a piece, "Karen's Cellar Blunder," with a photo of Claire pouring that night, the sign propped up beside him. "Newcomer learns a lesson. Don't doubt a Napa legend," it read. She was the punchline now, and the valley wasn't letting it go. Mrs. Delgado caught Claire over the fence one morning, her coffee steaming in the cool air. "She's a ghost now," she said, nodding toward Karen's place. "Won't be hollering at you again. Whole town's got your back." Claire nodded, his own mug warm in his hands. "Reckon she knows where she stands," he said, and they shared a quiet laugh. By the next weekend, Claire was back at it, down in the cellar, checking barrels, the familiar smell of oak and fermentation wrapping around him. He ran a hand over a bottle, the label faded but clear, Robinson Vintage 1985. It was one of the first, made with his granddaddy's recipe, and it hit him then, how far that dream had carried. The valley had changed since those days. Big wineries, fancy tours. But here he was, still standing, still pouring. And now with that sign out front, folks wouldn't forget. Mr. Hensley stopped by that evening, a bottle of Claire's 95 under his arm. "You're the heart of this street, Robinson," he said, settling on the porch steps. "Always were, just took a loudmouth to make it plain." Claire sat beside him, clinking his glass to Hensley's bottle. "Guess some folks need a nudge to see what's been here all along," he said. And they drank to that, the nights soft around them. The valley settled back into its ways. Vines growing, bottles clinking, stories swapped over fences. Claire leaned on his porch rail, looking out at the cellar, the sign catching the last light. He'd won, not with shouting or fuss, but with the life he'd built. Barrel by barrel, year by year. The truth had stood up for him, and the valley had raised a glass to it. That was enough. Claire Robinson's cellar door stood quiet now, the Robinson Cellar sign catching the Napa Valley sun as the days rolled on. He didn't lock it with a hurry anymore, just turned the key steady, same as he'd done for 40 years, the vines rustling like they were whispering his story back to him. Claire Mitchell lost that night, not because Claire raised his voice or threw a punch, but because she'd built her whole fuss on a lie that couldn't stand. She saw his old jacket, his weathered hands, and thought that was all he could amounted to. Turns out, the truth doesn't bend to quick looks. It grows deep, like roots under those vines, and shows itself when it's time. Looking back, it's clear as a good vintage why it played out this way. Karen stumbled over her own rush to judge, that itch to be right without asking first. Claire came out on top because he'd spent a lifetime tending barrels, pouring wine, building something real, work that spoke louder than her hollering ever could. She thought she'd nabbed a thief. Instead, she ran smack into a man the valley lifted glasses to. That's the catch with sizing folks up by their outside. You might miss the heart of what they've made, the years carved into every callus. There's something to take from this, something worth mulling over with your morning coffee or a glass at dusk. Don't judge a man by his coat or the dirt on his fingers. Ask what he's built, what he's carried, before you draw a line. Mistakes like Karen's aren't just a laugh for the neighborhood. They're a nudge to look closer, to see past the surface. A good life isn't loud or showy. It's steady, like Claire's cellar, holding strong through seasons and storms. He didn't need to prove himself to her. He'd already proved it to the valley, bottle by bottle, year by year. If this stirs up a memory, if something you've seen, maybe lived through, pass it along, share it over the fence with a neighbor, or swap it with a friend at the market. Stories like these aren't just about Karen's flop or Claire's wine. They're about keeping us honest, reminding us to think before we point. Napa saw it unfold, but it could have been any town, any street where folks work hard and stand tall. Claire held his ground because he knew what he'd grow, and that's a truth worth raising a glass to, wherever you're sitting tonight. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting stories every day. See you in the next one.